As we discussed in the earlier video, the BCG strategic style matrix has 4 quadrants or boxes, and now let's say a few words about each of those 4 positions. The first quadrant you named was called the classical style, and the classical style fits predictable but hard to change environments. And in such environments, a company can set goals, target favorable markets, and benefit from its resources, capabilities, and advantages. And often the strategies they're using can be used for many years in the future. Can you think of an example of companies who might fit this style? And to help you do that, remember the metaphor we used in an earlier session about the waterfall. Well, a good example of this style is the Shell oil company, or gas company you might call it. And they're a good example of the classical style. Why is that? That's because Shell can act on long-term and reliable forecast of energy supplies, consumption patterns, demand, etc. And because of this, they fit well into the classical style. But for some companies, the environment is less predictable. And in those cases, the second style might fit them better. That style you named adaptive in your matrix. And the adaptive style is suitable for less predictable and fast-moving conditions. But in this case, the company is capable of adapting to those conditions if and when they make the right decisions, because they have those capabilities. So that kind of company fits into the adaptive box. Now, can you think of any companies who might fit that strategic style? Well, for those of you who are interested in fashion, Zara, the clothing retailer, is a good example of the adaptive style. And this is because if Zara acts properly, they can adapt to the conditions as they're changing. For example, in Zara, new styles and fashion trends can be introduced within 3 weeks. This is because Zara have built up a very agile and lean capability to design and manufacture products fast. In the fashion business, as a matter of fact, most other retailers take from 4 to 8 weeks to adapt under those same conditions. Now, please remember that companies in the classical and adaptive strategic style quadrant like Shell and Zara are very capable of creating opportunities within their given environmental conditions because they have the competencies and capabilities to do so. And they built these strategic competencies and capabilities over a long period of time. Okay, the third style that you named was shaping. And rather than asking you to give an example of that one, a typical example of this style would be companies in the internet software business. And many of those companies do have shaping strategies. And they have shaping strategies because they're all faced with an unpredictable future, and a future where new competitors are entering all the time. And in addition to that, growth is often very rapid for them. And their primary goal for that type of company is to try and shape the environment. They want to have an impact on the environment, and they try to do this in order to create an advantage for them before another company comes in and does it. So what's needed there? Flexibility is critical for shaping the strategy and working under those conditions. This is because companies who are shapers are able to rely on accurate predictions of the future, but this requires that they're experimenting all the time, testing, learning, failing, etc. And they're experimenting all the time in order to discover solutions for the highly unpredictable environment they operate in. And quite often, as a matter of fact, they're also cooperating and collaborating with other companies so they can reduce the risks in that experimentation. Because as we all know by now, experiments often fail. The fourth strategic style you named was visionary. And they're often called visionary companies because they have both the power to shape the future of their industry and they can predict, or you might even say, create the future. And in many of these kinds of companies, they're operating in entirely new, unknown markets. And under such conditions, they must be capable of quickly assembling the necessary resources and executing effectively under those conditions, because that's critical to be able to do that. You might even say that those companies have a lot of grit, because as we all know by now, grit helps. And this visionary style of strategy could be described as more entrepreneurial way of working. And this reminds me of the final session in the boot camp when we will discuss startups. You might argue that many startups are using the visionary style, or they should be. But rather than talk about that right now, we'll get into that during the startup session. Now here is something that you might be thinking about. What is the most common strategic style which companies are using today? And that's a great question. And we have an answer, because according to the BCG research, the most common style used by companies today are the two styles which are most suited to predictable environments. And you named them visionary and classical. As a matter of fact, 40% of companies use the visionary style and 35% use the classical style. And that's a very interesting finding. And why is that? It's an interesting finding because companies are using those styles even if their environments are clearly unpredictable. And that is a big strategic mistake indeed, because they might be better served by considering to use the other styles given the unpredictability of their business. This is especially true because we can see that only 16% are using adaptive and 9% shaping styles, and those are more suitable for unpredictable environments. Wow, that was a lot to absorb a lot of information in what might be the shortest set of videos in this whole bootcamp. So let's now try to pull together these important ideas and summarize the 3 lessons you should leave this strategy lesson with. The first lesson is that there are 2 conditions in a company's business environment which will determine the best strategic style for that company. The first condition is the level of predictability. And the second condition you called malleability, or to simplify that term, we use the word workable. Think of somebody making clay. The second lesson is that there are 4 strategic styles which suit those 2 environments, and those 4 were called classical, adaptive, shaping, and visionary. The classical and adaptive styles are seen in Shell and Zara as an example, and they're suitable for companies who are capable of creating opportunities within fixed environmental constraints. Shaping and visionary strategies, on the other hand, are suitable when the business environment can be shaped or molded, but there's other conditions that they're faced with. And finally, the third lesson is that most companies use classical and visionary styles. As a matter of fact, 75% of the time they do that, even if many of those companies are operating in unpredictable environments. And that, folks, is a big mistake.